The gunshot came first. Then the screaming. Glass exploded across the marble floor of the Seoul Grand Hyatt Ballroom as 3 men in black burst through the service entrance, weapons raised, chairs flying as 200 guests dropped to the floor. In the middle of the chaos, one man did not move. He did not flinch. He stood at the head of the room in a tailored black suit, a glass of whiskey still in his hand, and watched the gunman approach him the way a wolf watches something smaller circle too close. Kang Min-jae, the lead gunman said, his voice shaking despite the gun in his hand. You have something that belongs to someone else. Min-jae set the glass down slowly on the table beside him. He did not raise his hands. He did not call for help. He simply smiled, the kind of smile that made grown men's blood run cold. I don't have anything, he said quietly, that belongs to anyone but me. The lead gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. Wrong answer. Careful, Min-jae said, taking one slow step forward, close enough now that the barrel of the gun nearly touched his chest. The last man who pointed a weapon at me is still missing 3 fingers. I let him keep his life as a courtesy. I don't extend courtesies twice. For 1 heartbeat, the gunman hesitated, and that hesitation was the only opening Daniel Park needed. He came through the ballroom side door low and fast, 2 shots fired before the intruders even registered movement, and within seconds the 3 men were disarmed, bleeding, and on the floor, guests scrambling for the exits behind overturned tables. Min-jae hadn't moved an inch the entire time. He crouched down in front of the lead gunman, gripping his collar, and asked one question in a voice so calm it was somehow more frightening than if he'd screamed it. Who sent you? The man said nothing. Min-jae didn't ask again. He simply nodded once at Daniel, and the message was understood without another word spoken. What happened in the next 10 seconds would be the reason 3 men never returned to whoever sent them. What happened in the following 90 minutes would be the reason the most feared man in Seoul lost everything he thought mattered, and found the one thing he never knew he needed. This is the story of a man who built an empire out of fear, who was told his empire meant nothing without an heir, and who was willing to destroy an innocent woman's life to get one. It's the story of the woman who refused to be bought. And it's the story of the child neither of them knew existed, a secret buried so deep it nearly cost all 3 of them their lives. Stay until the end, because the final twist changes everything you think you understand about this family. 6 hours earlier, there had been no gunfire. Only silence, the particular, suffocating silence of the Kang family dinner table, where 40 years of ambition and cruelty had been passed down like a family heirloom nobody wanted but no one dared refuse. Kang Min-jae sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 20, though only 6 people occupied it that night. His mother, Madame Heir, sat at the opposite end, her spine straight, her eyes sharp despite 63 years of carefully preserved composure. His half-brother Seo-jun sat to her right, saying nothing, watching everything. Senior men of the organization filled the remaining seats, eating in careful silence, because everyone at that table understood one unspoken rule. You did not speak in the Kang house until you were spoken to. Madame Heir was the one who broke the silence. The Kang family, she said, setting down her chopsticks with deliberate precision, cannot remain powerful without an heir. Min-jae did not look up from his plate. I don't need a son to prove I'm powerful. You will, his mother said, when you're dead. The words landed like a blade dropped flat on the table. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loudly. Seo-jun's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that Min-jae caught it from the corner of his eye and filed it away the way he filed away every small betrayal he intended to remember later. Everything I built, Min-jae said, finally looking at his mother, I built with my own hands. Not because someone gave me a name to protect. And who protects it when you're gone? Heiren's voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it worse. 38 years old, Min-jae. No wife. No child. No one to carry what your father spent his life building, what you have spent yours expanding. You think power lasts forever because you're strong today. Power without blood is a rumor. It disappears the moment you close your eyes. Then let it disappear, Min-jae said. I would rather my name mean something while I'm alive than be carried by a stranger who never earned it. Heirin's eyes narrowed, the closest thing to genuine anger she allowed herself to show at a dinner table full of witnesses. You speak like a man who has never buried anything he loved. You think this is about pride. It isn't. It's about survival. Enemies don't fear men without succession. They wait for them. The moment word spreads that Kang Min-jae has no heir, every rival who has bowed his head to you for the last decade will start counting the days until your funeral. Seo-jun spoke for the first time that evening, his voice deceptively mild. Mother only means to protect what you've built, brother. We all do. Min-jae looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the temperature of the room seemed to drop. You've never once in your life protected anything that wasn't yours to gain from, Seo-jun. Don't start pretending tonight. Seo-jun's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still. Enough, Heirin said, though she did not look away from her son. I am not asking you to fall in love, Min-jae. I am telling you what this family requires. Find a wife. Give this family a future. Or watch everything your father and I built be picked apart by men who are already circling. Min-jae said nothing. He picked up his glass, drank, and set it down without a sound. But the words followed him out of that dining room and into every hour of the night that came after, settling into his chest like a stone he couldn't put down. That night, alone in the private wing of his estate, the truth arrived in a way no threat, no rival, no bullet had ever managed. His personal physician sat across from him with a folder in his lap, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you, the doctor said. The tests are conclusive. There's scarring, old damage, likely from the injury you sustained years ago. Your chances of naturally fathering a child are extremely low. Not impossible, but low enough that I would not, in good conscience, tell you to expect it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Kang Min-jae felt something close to fear. He had survived assassination attempts. He had buried men who tried to kill him and shaken hands with men who wanted to. He had never once let his face show weakness in front of another human being. Is there nothing that can be done? Min-jae asked, and his voice, usually so level it unsettled people, cracked slightly on the last word. The doctor hesitated. There are procedures. Treatments. None of them guaranteed. I would be lying to you if I said there was a simple solution. I'm sorry, Mr. Kang. I know this isn't the answer you wanted. I didn't want an answer, Min-jae said quietly. I wanted a guarantee. There are no guarantees left in this, the doctor said, closing the folder gently, as though it might still cause pain by existing in the room. Only probabilities. And right now, the probabilities are not in your favor. But alone, after the doctor left, he sat in the dark of his study and pressed both hands over his face, and for a long moment, he simply did not move. He thought about his mother's words at dinner. Power without blood is a rumor, and hated that some ugly, frightened part of him was beginning to believe her. He thought about his father, a man who had never once told him he was proud of him, who had measured Min-jae's worth entirely by what he could produce, what he could conquer, what he could pass down. He thought about the fact that even now, with everything he had built, he was still terrified of becoming nothing in his father's eyes, even with his father 11 years dead. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish. He stared at the city until the lights blurred, and somewhere in that blur, a decision hardened in him that would set the rest of the story in motion. He would not fail at this. Whatever it took, whoever it required, he would not be the Kang who let the bloodline end. When Daniel Park entered 20 minutes later, his oldest friend, his most loyal bodyguard, the only man alive Min-jae trusted without question, he found his boss standing at the window, staring out at the city lights like they'd personally betrayed him. Boss! Min-jae didn't turn around. Find me a woman. You have plenty of women, boss. You don't need me for that. Not for that. Min-jae's voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it trembled. Find me a woman who cannot be bought. A woman who doesn't already want something from me. Because everyone I've ever met wants something from me, Daniel, and I need, just once, someone who doesn't. Daniel studied his friend's face for a long moment. He had known Min-jae since they were teenagers running errands for men twice their size, since before either of them understood what kind of world they'd been born into. He had never heard him sound like this. "I'll look," Daniel said quietly. "Give me a few days." He didn't need a few days. He needed less than 24 hours, because fate, or something crueler than fate, had already put the answer directly in Min-jae's path. Her name was Amara Johnson, and she had absolutely no idea her life was about to collide with his. If you're already hooked, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next 15 minutes is going to completely change how you see this man, and you don't want to miss it. Amara Johnson had been in Seoul for 3 years, and in 3 years, she had learned exactly one truth about the city. It did not care how tired you were. It did not care that you'd buried your mother 8 months ago, that your savings were nearly gone, that you were translating contracts until midnight just to keep the lights on in a one-room apartment in Mapo. Seoul moved whether you kept up or not. She worked that night as an event coordinator for a private function at the Grand Hyatt, translation services, VIP liaison, the kind of job that paid well for one night and nothing for the 2 weeks after. She wore a black dress that wasn't hers, borrowed from a coworker, because her own good clothes had been sold months ago along with almost everything else she owned that wasn't essential. She was crossing the ballroom floor with a tray of documents when a man stepped directly into her path, blocking her, clearly expecting her to move around him the way everyone else in the room instinctively did. She didn't move. "Excuse me," she said. "You're in my way." The man turned. He was tall, dressed in black, with the kind of stillness that Amara would later understand meant something dangerous, but in that moment she only saw an arrogant man who thought the room belonged to him. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, not unkindly, more curious than anything. "No," Amara said honestly. "Should I?" Around them, several guests had gone quiet, watching with expressions somewhere between horror and fascination. A senior member of the hotel staff appeared at Amara's elbow, pale, whispering urgently in Korean that she needed to apologize immediately, that this was Kang Min-jae, that she had no idea what she'd just done. Amara looked at the man again, really looked, and something in her, grief, exhaustion, the particular fearlessness of someone who has already survived the worst thing that could happen to her, refused to bow. "I'm sorry if I was rude," she said, "but I have work to do, and standing in the middle of a room glaring at people isn't exactly clearing a path." For a moment, nobody in the ballroom moved. Then Kang Min-jae laughed. Not the polite, practiced laugh he gave investors and rivals. A real one, short and surprised, like it had been pulled out of him against his will. "What's your name?" he asked. "Why does it matter?" "Because," he said, stepping aside at last, "you're the first person in this city who's spoken to me like I'm just a man." "Maybe that's because, to me you are," Amara said. "I don't know your empire. I don't know your reputation. I just know you were standing in the middle of a walkway, like you owned the floor." "I do own the floor," Min-jae said. "I own the hotel." Amara blinked, and for one unguarded second, something like embarrassment flickered across her face before she covered it with defiance. "Then I guess you can afford to let one waitress walk past without an apology." "I never asked for an apology." "Good," she said, "because you weren't getting one." He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he doesn't yet understand but already suspects he wants to. "What's your name?" he asked again, quieter this time. "Amara," she said finally. "Amara Johnson." "Amara," he repeated, like he was testing the shape of it. "I imagine we'll speak again." "I really don't think we will." Amara didn't answer that. She walked past him, tray balanced, heart hammering in a way she refused to examine too closely, and told herself she would never see him again. She was wrong. 3 days later, a black car was waiting outside her apartment building when she left for work. Daniel Park stepped out, polite, formal, terrifyingly calm. "Ms. Johnson, Mr. Kang would like a word." "I don't know a Mr. Kang." "You met him Tuesday night." "At the Hyatt." Amara's stomach dropped. She had spent 3 days trying not to think about the man with the cold eyes and the surprised laugh, telling herself it meant nothing, that men like that forgot women like her the moment they walked away. She had been wrong about that too. She agreed to the meeting only because Daniel made it clear there would be no peace until she did. She found Min-jae waiting in a private room of a restaurant so expensive she'd never once considered walking through its doors, sitting alone at a table for two, a folder closed in front of him. "I looked into your situation," he said, without greeting, the moment she sat down. "Your mother passed 8 months ago. She left you debts you didn't know existed. You're 3 months behind on rent you're too proud to ask anyone for help with." Amara's face went hot. "You had me investigated. I have everyone investigated. It's how I stay alive." He slid the folder across the table. "I'll pay it. All of it. The debts, the rent, whatever you need. Consider it done." She didn't open the folder. "Why would you do that?" "Because I want something from you eventually, and I prefer starting relationships with generosity rather than desperation." The word relationship made her skin crawl. "I don't need your money. Everyone needs money, Ms. Johnson. Not from strangers who think they can buy their way into someone's life." She stood, pushing the folder back toward him. "I'm not for sale." Min-jae watched her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, not the wounded ego of a powerful man refused. Something closer to genuine curiosity, like she was a puzzle he hadn't expected to find interesting. "Everyone has a price," he said quietly. "Then you haven't met the right people," Amara said and walked out. She didn't look back. She didn't see the way he watched her go, didn't see him sit alone at that table for another 20 minutes without touching his drink, didn't see Daniel enter afterward and ask quietly, "So, did she take it?" "No," Min-jae said. "You're smiling." "I'm not." "Boss, you're smiling." Min-jae said nothing. But later that night, he gave Daniel a new instruction, one that would change the trajectory of Amara Johnson's entire life. "Find out everything about her mother," he said. "Everything. Where she worked, who she knew, why her name feels familiar to me." Daniel frowned. "Familiar how?" "I don't know yet," Min-jae said. "But I intend to find out." What Daniel discovered 2 days later would set in motion a chain of events neither man could have predicted, a connection buried so deep in the Kang family's past that even Min-jae, who thought he knew every secret his family had ever hidden, had no idea it existed. Amara's mother, Grace Johnson, had once worked for the Kang family, nearly 9 years ago, as a private nurse. Daniel brought the file to Min-jae's office late that night, and for the first time since his conversation with the doctor, Min-jae felt something colder than fear settle into his chest. 9 years ago, Min-jae repeated slowly. I know what that is, boss," Daniel said quietly. "That's the year everyone told you your father's household lost a child." The threat started 3 days after that conversation, though Amara had no idea they were connected to anything Min-jae had done. The first message was almost easy to dismiss, a blocked number for words. "Stop asking questions." She deleted it and told herself it was spam. The second came the next night. Leave Seoul. You don't know what you're involved in. By the third night, the messages had stopped being vague. A photo arrived, her own apartment building, taken from across the street, time-stamped less than an hour earlier. "We know where you sleep." Amara sat on her bed with the phone shaking in her hand, and for the first time since her mother's funeral, she felt truly, physically afraid. She called the police. They took her statement, told her to change her locks, and offered little else. She assumed, reasonably, that it had something to do with her mother's debts, some collector, some unresolved account from the mess her mother had left behind, someone willing to intimidate a grieving daughter into paying faster. She didn't sleep well. She started checking the locks on her apartment door twice before bed, and once, around 2 in the morning, she was certain she heard footsteps on the stairwell outside her door that stopped directly outside it and stood there, unmoving, for nearly a full minute before retreating. She had no idea, in that moment, that the danger following her had nothing to do with a stranger's debt and everything to do with a 9-year-old secret her own mother had died trying to protect. Then, one night walking home from a late translation job, 3 men closed in around her in the alley behind her building, and Amara understood, with sudden and total clarity, that this was not about debt collection. She never got the chance to scream. A black car screeched to a stop at the alley's mouth, and 4 of Min-jae's men were out of it before the attackers had time to react. It was over in less than a minute, brutal, efficient, terrifying to watch. Amara stood frozen against the brick wall, shaking, as the men who'd attacked her were dragged away, and Kang Min-jae himself stepped out of the car, his face carved from stone. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "What is happening?" Amara's voice cracked. "Why is this happening to me?" Min-jae's jaw tightened. "You are in danger because of me. Then why are you the one following me?" She was crying now, adrenaline and terror finally breaking through the composure she'd held onto for 3 days straight. "Why does everything bad that's happened to me since I met you keep happening because of you?" "Because," Min-jae said, and for the first time, she heard something underneath the ice in his voice, something almost like guilt. "I am the only person who can keep you alive." He didn't touch her. He didn't try to comfort her the way she half expected, half feared he would. He simply stood there, letting her cry, letting her be furious, absorbing it without flinching, and something about that, his stillness, his refusal to perform sympathy he probably didn't fully feel, made Amara trust him a fraction more than she wanted to. It was a mistake she would spend the rest of the story trying to understand. 5 days later, he made his offer formally, sitting across from her in that same private restaurant room, the folder from before now replaced by a different one, a marriage contract, drafted by lawyers, thick as a small book. "1 year, Min-jae said. You become my wife. Publicly. You will want for nothing, money, safety, protection from whoever is coming after you. In exchange, I give you an heir," Amara finished. Her voice was flat. "That's what this is. That's what all of this has been." Yes. At least he was honest. She gave him that much. "No," she said. "Absolutely not. I would rather struggle for the rest of my life than become some incubator for a man I don't even know." She stood to leave. Min-jae let her. He didn't grab her arm, didn't threaten her, didn't do any of the things she braced herself for. He simply watched her walk to the door and said quietly, "The offer doesn't expire. And Ms. Johnson, my protection isn't conditional on your answer. You'll have it regardless." That night, after she left, he called Daniel with a single instruction. "Keep her safe, whatever it costs. She never has to know." Daniel didn't ask why. He'd stopped asking why a long time ago, but this was different, and both men knew it. Amara held out for 6 days. On the 7th, she came home to find an eviction notice taped to her door and a phone call from a debt collector informing her that her mother's outstanding obligations she hadn't even known existed until 3 weeks ago, were being called in immediately, in full, with legal action threatened if she didn't comply within 72 hours. She sat on the floor of her half-packed apartment and cried until she had nothing left, and when she finally picked up her phone, her hands were steady in a way her heart was not. "I'll do it," she told Min-jae when he answered. "But I have one condition. One, and it's non-negotiable. Name it. I will never be forced to have a child. If it happens because I choose it. Not because I'm trapped into it, not because it's in a contract. The moment I feel like a broodmare instead of a person, I walk and you let me." There was a long silence on the line. "Agreed," Min-jae said finally. Neither of them, in that moment, understood how impossible that promise would become to keep. The wedding was small, cold, and entirely for show. 20 guests, a contract disguised as vows, a ring that cost more than Amara had earned in the last 3 years combined, sitting strange and heavy on her finger. Madame Heir watched the ceremony with an expression Amara couldn't read, something between satisfaction and suspicion, like a woman inspecting livestock she wasn't yet convinced would breed well. Moving into the Kang mansion felt less like moving into a marriage and more like moving into custody. The house was enormous, cold, staffed by people who watched Amara with careful, guarded eyes, unsure whether to treat her as their future mistress or a temporary inconvenience. Min-jae was rarely present, and when he was, their conversations were brief, tense, transactional. "There's a dinner Friday," he told her one evening, barely looking up from his phone. "Investors." You'll need to attend. Is that a request or an order? Does it matter? It matters to me. He looked up then, something flickering across his face. Irritation, maybe, or the faint surprise of a man unused to being questioned in his own house. It's a request, he said finally. You can say no. Then no. He blinked. Then, unexpectedly, something like the ghost of a smile crossed his mouth.
Fine.
I'll go alone. She didn't understand it then, but that was the first crack. The first moment Kang Min-jae, a man who had never in his adult life allowed anyone to refuse him anything, simply accepted no as an answer and walked away without punishment, without anger, without demanding compliance. It wouldn't be the last crack, but it would be the one that mattered most, later, when everything fell apart. She changed her mind about the dinner 2 days later. Not for him, she told herself, but because she was tired of pacing an unfamiliar house with nothing to do and no one to talk to. She wore the black dress she'd worn the night they met, the borrowed one, now hers. And when she walked down the stairs, Min-jae actually stopped mid-sentence with one of his lieutenants and stared.
You said no, he said.
I changed my mind. Don't make it weird. He didn't. But at the dinner, surrounded by investors twice her age who spoke about her like she wasn't in the room, Amara surprised everyone, Min-jae most of all, by correcting a translation error in a contract clause that would have cost his company nearly $2 million, catching it mid-conversation, calm and precise, before anyone else at the table had noticed. The room went quiet. Min-jae looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time all over again. Where did you learn contract law? He asked her later, in the car, after the guests had gone. I didn't, Amara said. I learned how to read carefully. It's what happens when you grow up with nothing and no one's going to double-check your work for you. Min-jae was quiet for a long moment. You just saved my company $2 million. You're welcome, she said and looked out the window and didn't see the way he watched her the rest of the ride home, something recalculating behind his eyes. Not about the money. About her. Weeks passed in a strange rhythm of distance and unexpected proximity. Amara began noticing things about her husband that didn't fit the reputation that preceded him. She saw him leave the house early one Saturday morning, dressed down, no security detail visible, and out of curiosity and boredom and a restlessness she refused to name loneliness, she followed him. He drove to a children's hospital on the outskirts of the city. She watched from across the street as he walked in through a side entrance, greeted by staff who clearly knew him, who smiled at him in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She waited 2 hours. When he emerged, a small girl in a wheelchair was laughing at something he'd said, and the nurse beside her was thanking him with genuine warmth in her voice. Amara never told him she'd followed him, but she started watching him differently after that. A week later, she found him at his father's grave, alone. No bodyguards in sight, standing in the rain without an umbrella, like he hadn't noticed it was falling. She didn't approach. She stood at a distance and watched a man the entire city feared stand utterly, achingly alone in front of a headstone, saying nothing, for nearly 20 minutes. He isn't completely heartless, she thought, and hated herself a little for how much that thought softened something in her chest. The real crack came 3 weeks later, when Amara fell seriously ill, a fever that spiked overnight, bad enough that the house staff panicked and called Min-jae home from an emergency meeting he'd told them under no circumstances to interrupt. He arrived within 20 minutes, still in a suit, and didn't leave her side for the next 30 hours. He canceled everything. He sat beside her bed, pressed cool cloths to her forehead with hands that had ordered violence without hesitation and now moved with a gentleness that startled her even through the haze of fever. When she woke at 4 in the morning, disoriented and weak, she found him asleep in the chair beside her bed, still in his dress shirt, his tie loosened, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle that told her he hadn't meant to fall asleep at all. She watched him for a long moment before she spoke. Min-jae. He woke instantly, the way people who've lived dangerous lives always do, immediately alert. You're awake. How do you feel? Better. Why are you still here? He hesitated. Where else would I be? You have a business to run. An empire. I'm sure there's somewhere more important than a sick room. There isn't, he said, and the honesty in his voice surprised them both. They talked quietly in the dark for almost an hour about nothing important, and then, gradually, about everything that mattered. He told her, in fragments, about a childhood that had never once been allowed to be a childhood. About a father who treated him like an investment rather than a son, who beat obedience into him before he was old enough to understand what obedience meant. About a mother who loved power more visibly than she'd ever loved him. Is that why you want a son so badly? Amara asked quietly. So, you can be the father yours never was? Min-jae was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to be a father, he admitted finally. I only know how not to be one. I thought that might be enough. He didn't answer her question directly. But she understood, in the silence that followed, that she'd gotten closer to the truth of him than perhaps anyone ever had. She should have been more careful about what that closeness would cost her. It was 3 days after her recovery that Amara made the mistake that would unravel everything. She'd been exploring the west wing of the mansion, a section of the house Min-jae had never explicitly forbidden her from entering, but had also never invited her into, when she found a door that had been left unlocked, just barely, just enough that it swung open under the weight of her hand. Inside was a room that didn't match the rest of the house. No grandeur, no staged elegance, just filing cabinets, an old desk, boxes of documents, and photographs pinned to a corkboard on the far wall like the private obsession room of a man conducting his own investigation. She stepped inside despite every instinct telling her to leave. The photographs were old, yellowed at the edges. Most meant nothing to her, meant she didn't recognize buildings, business documents. But one photograph, near the center of the board, stopped her cold. It was her mother. Younger, maybe 30, standing beside a man Amara vaguely recognized from other photographs in the house as Min-jae's father. And in her mother's arms, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, was a newborn baby. Amara's hands began to shake. She reached up and pulled the photograph off the board, turning it over. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 3 words, Kang bloodline hidden. Behind her, the door creaked. She spun around, the photograph still clutched in her hand, to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his face pale, his expression somewhere between alarm and something that looked almost like fear. "Miss Johnson," he said carefully, "you shouldn't be in here. What is this?" Amara's voice shook. "Daniel, what is this photograph? Why is my mother holding a Kang baby?" Daniel didn't answer, and his silence, more than anything he could have said, told her that whatever this was, it was far worse than anything she'd imagined. Min-jae found her 20 minutes later, still standing in that room, the photograph gripped so tightly in her hands that the edges had bent under her fingers. "Amara, tell me what this is." Her voice was ice now, all the softness of the last few weeks gone. "Tell me why my mother is standing next to her father with a baby in her arms. Tell me why this photograph says hidden." Min-jae's face went through several expressions in quick succession, shock, calculation, and finally, something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight he'd been carrying alone was finally about to be shared. "There was a child," he said quietly, "years ago, born into this family. He disappeared shortly after birth. The official story was that he died, complications, and illness, something no one ever fully explained. I was young. I never believed it. What does my mother have to do with it?" "I don't know," Min-jae admitted. "I swear to you, Amara, I don't know. But I intend to find out. Whatever your mother knew, whatever role she played, we're going to uncover it together." She wanted to believe him. Some desperate part of her, the part that had watched him sleep in a hospital chair and stand alone in the rain at his father's grave, wanted badly to believe him. But a colder, more exhausted part of her had learned, over the last several weeks, exactly how good the Kang family was at hiding things. "I don't trust you," she said quietly. "I don't trust any of this. I want to leave." Something shifted in his face, a flash of something raw and unguarded that she hadn't seen from him before. "Amara, I need to leave, Min-jae." He said nothing, but when she turned toward the door, she found that some deeper, darker part of the man she'd started to believe she understood had already begun making a decision she wasn't going to like. If this story has you sitting on the edge of your seat, drop a comment below telling me what you think is really going on with that photograph. I read every single one, and trust me, you have no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes. Amara found the recording 2 days later, tucked inside an old jewelry box that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions she'd kept after the funeral. It was a small digital voice recorder, the kind her mother had used for work notes, and Amara had never once thought to check what was on it. Her mother's voice filled the quiet of her room, tired and urgent, recorded, based on the date stamp, almost 9 years earlier. If they ever find the boy, her mother said, her voice trembling in a way Amara had never heard in life. Asterisk, don't let the Kang family take him. Whatever happens to me, whatever they offer, don't let them near him. He deserves better than what that family will make of him. Asterisk. The recording ended. Amara sat frozen on her bed, replaying it 3 times for times, until the words stopped feeling like sound and started feeling like a verdict. The child hadn't died. Her mother had known that. Her mother had been protecting him. And now Amara was married into the very family her mother had spent her final working years trying to shield a child from. She found Min-jae in his study that night, the recorder in her hand, her chest tight with a fury she could barely contain. He's alive, she said, before he could even greet her. The child. He's alive, and my mother knew it, and she spent years protecting him from your family. From you. Min-jae rose from his desk slowly. Let me hear it. She played the recording. She watched his face as he listened, watched the color drain from it, watched his jaw tighten, watched something dangerous settle behind his eyes. I never knew, he said quietly when it ended. I swear to you, Amara, I never knew any of this. I don't believe you. The words came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't take them back. I don't believe anything in this house anymore. I want out. Tonight. She turned to leave. And that was the moment, the exact, precise moment, that Kang Min-jae's carefully controlled composure finally shattered. You can't leave, he said, and his voice had changed, gone low and hard in a way that made the hair on the back of Amara's neck rise. She turned back slowly. Excuse me? You heard me. He stepped around the desk, closer than she wanted him. There are people who want to hurt you, Amara. People connected to this exact secret you just uncovered. If you walk out of this house right now, I cannot guarantee your safety, and I am not willing to take that risk. That's not your decision to make. It is tonight. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, not weakness, but something closer to desperation. A man watching the one honest thing in his life try to walk out the door and losing his grip on every principle he'd built himself around. I can't let you walk away. You don't get to decide that, Amara said, her voice shaking now more from fear than anger. I am not your property. I was never your property. That was the entire condition of this marriage. The condition has changed. Min-jae's obsession, the thing he'd spent 38 years disguising as control, as strength, as power, finally overwhelmed every ounce of judgment he had left. He walked to the intercom on the wall and gave an order in a voice that left no room for negotiation. Lock the gates. No one leaves the property. No one, including Mrs. Kang, until I say otherwise. Amara stared at him, and for the first time since she'd met him, she felt something colder than fear settle into her chest. Certainty. Certainty that whatever gentleness she'd seen in this man, whatever cracks of humanity had shown through in hospital chairs and rainy graveyards, none of it changed what he ultimately was. You've just become exactly what everyone warned me you were, she whispered. Daniel appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, his face carved with an expression Min-jae had never seen from his oldest friend before. Disappointment. Boss, Daniel said quietly, this isn't protection anymore. This is exactly what her mother's recording warned her about. Stay out of it, Daniel. With respect, boss. Daniel's voice hardened. I've followed you into gunfire. I've followed you into rooms I knew we might not walk out of. But I will not follow you into becoming the man your father was. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the entire house. Min-jae didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Amara standing there, trembling, a prisoner in a house she'd once, briefly, allowed herself to believe could become a home. Daniel found her an hour later, sitting on the floor of her locked bedroom, staring at nothing. He knocked twice, a code they developed without ever discussing it, a way of telling her it was safe to open the door. "I can't get you out tonight," he said quietly once inside. "The gates are locked, and I won't risk your life trying to force something in the dark. But I can help you find out the truth. All of it. If you're going to be trapped here, at least let's figure out why." Amara looked up at him, exhausted, furious, and terrified all at once. "Why would you help me? He's your boss. Your friend." "Because," Daniel said, sitting down across from her, "I've known Kang Min-jae since we were 14 years old, running errands for men who would have killed us both without blinking. I have watched that man become someone I don't fully recognize over the last few weeks, and some of it has been good, Ms. Johnson. But this isn't good. This is his father's ghost taking over, and I won't stand by and watch it happen to someone else." Together, over the following 2 days, working in secret, in stolen hours between Min-jae's meetings and Madame Heirin's watchful presence, Amara and Daniel began piecing together a truth that had been buried for 9 years. The child, they discovered, had not died of illness. He had been quietly removed from the estate weeks after birth, his existence erased from every official record, his birth certificate altered, his very name changed. And the person who had ordered it, the person whose signature appeared on the transfer documents Daniel finally located in an old storage archive, was not a stranger, not a rival, not an enemy from outside the family. It was Madame Heirin, Min-jae's own mother. Amara confronted her the following afternoon, in the sunroom where Heirin took her tea each day at exactly the same hour. Surrounded by orchids, she tended herself with more visible tenderness than she'd ever shown another human being. "I know what you did," Amara said, setting the documents on the table between them. 9 years ago, the child. You had him taken away." For a long moment, Madame Heirin didn't react at all. She simply lifted her teacup, took a slow sip, and set it back down with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "You have no idea," she said finally, "what protecting this family requires." "Protecting?" "You erased a child's existence." "I eliminated a threat," Heirin corrected, her voice sharpening for the first time. "Do you understand what a child like that could have become in the wrong hands, wielded by the wrong rival? A weapon. A liability. A vulnerability my husband was too sentimental to see. I did what he could not." Amara felt sick. "Where is he? Where is the child now?" Heirin's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, something flickered behind them. Not guilt, Amara realized. Calculation. The look of a woman deciding how much truth she could afford to release into a room she no longer fully controlled. "You should be more concerned," Heirin said quietly, "with who else already knows the answer to that question." "Does Min-jae know what you did?" "No." For the first time, something almost human cracked through Heirin's composure, not remorse, but a kind of tired, brittle honesty. "And he will hate me the moment he learns it."
"I have made my peace with that."
"I made my peace with it 9 years ago, the night I signed the papers myself, because a mother's job is not to be loved. It is to make certain her son survives long enough to be hated by him later." "That's not protection," Amara said, her voice shaking now, no longer from fear but from fury. "That's cruelty dressed up as sacrifice. You stole a child from his father. You let Min-jae spend years believing he had nothing, when the truth is you decided, alone, that he didn't deserve to know. And you," Heirin said, setting down her teacup with a click that echoed through the quiet sunroom, "married my son for money and safety, and now you sit in my house lecturing me about what a mother owes her child. Careful, Ms. Johnson. Glass houses." Amara stood, her hands trembling. "I am nothing like you." "We'll see," Heirin said, unbothered, reaching for her orchids as though the conversation had already ended. "Every woman who walks into this family believes that, at first." The answer arrived faster than either of them expected, and in a form that shattered whatever fragile stability remained in the Kang household. Daniel located the child within 36 hours. A boy, 8 years old, living under a different name 2 hours outside Seoul with a family who had no idea of his true origins, paid a lifetime allowance by a source Daniel traced, after considerable effort, back through 3 shell accounts to Madame Heir herself. She had not eliminated the child, Amara realized. She had simply hidden him well enough to control the outcome herself, keeping her options open in a way that was, in its own cold fashion, entirely consistent with everything Amara had learned about the woman. His name was Ethan. A DNA sample, quietly obtained through the boy's adoptive family under a pretense Daniel had carefully constructed, confirmed what none of them had dared say aloud until the results arrived. Ethan was Kang Min-jae's biological son. Min-jae's entire desperate campaign, the medical diagnosis, the search for a woman who couldn't be bought, the manipulation and control that had led him to lock his own wife inside his home, had been built on a lie his mother had constructed 9 years earlier. He already had a son. He had always had a son. His mother had simply decided, unilaterally, that Min-jae didn't deserve to know. When Amara showed him the results, standing in his study with Daniel beside her for support, she watched something break open in Kang Min-jae that she suspected had been sealed shut since childhood. 9 years, he said, his voice hollow. 9 years, I believed I had nothing. 9 years my mother let me believe my own blood had died, while she kept him alive somewhere, controlling him, controlling me, because it suited whatever plan she was running. Min-jae, I locked you in this house, he said suddenly, looking at Amara with an expression of dawning horror, as though he were only now truly seeing what he'd done. I threatened your freedom because I was terrified of losing the one honest thing in my life, and the entire time, the reason I thought I needed you, the heir, the bloodline, all of it was already alive. My mother made me into exactly what she wanted. Desperate, controllable, willing to do anything for a lie she'd invented. Before Amara could respond, before any of them could process the weight of what had just been confirmed, the sound of gunfire erupted somewhere in the lower floors of the mansion, and every instinct in Daniel's body snapped into motion. Boss, we have a problem, he said, already moving toward the door, already reaching for his weapon. A bigger one. Seo-jun had been waiting for this exact moment. Min-jae's half-brother had known about Ethan for over a year, longer than Min-jae had known his son existed at all. He had found the boy through his own investigation of their mother's finances, had confirmed the DNA connection privately, and had spent months quietly building leverage, waiting for the precise moment when revealing the truth would cause maximum damage to Min-jae's already fragile grip on the organization. That moment had arrived faster than Seo-jun planned, forced by Amara and Daniel's investigation, and rather than let the truth slip out of his control, Seo-jun made his move early, hard, violent, and decisive. Armed men loyal to Seo-jun stormed the mansion's lower levels within minutes, cutting the estate's communication lines, moving with the coordinated precision of a coup that had been planned for months, not improvised in hours. He's been planning this, Daniel said grimly, pulling Amara and Min-jae toward the reinforced safe room off the study. The child was never just information to him. It was ammunition. Where's Ethan? Min-jae's voice was sharp with a fear Amara had never heard from him before. Not fear for himself, not fear for his empire, but the raw, immediate fear of a father who had known his son existed for less than an hour and was already terrified of losing him. With his adoptive family still, Daniel confirmed, checking his phone with shaking hands. But boss, Seo-jun's men are already moving in that direction. He knows exactly where the boy is. He's known for months. Min-jae's face went white, then hardened into something Amara had never seen from him. Not the cold control of the Mafia boss she'd married, not the vulnerable man who'd fallen asleep in a hospital chair, but something new entirely, a father, moving toward the single most important decision of his life. I need to get to him, Min-jae said. Now. Boss, the estate is under attack. If you leave, then I leave. Min-jae was already moving, already pulling a weapon from the safe behind his desk, already transformed into the version of himself that had built an empire out of decisive, ruthless action. Amara, stay with Daniel. You'll be safe here.
No.
Amara's voice was steady despite the chaos erupting throughout the house. I'm coming with you. That boy's existence just upended my entire life too. I'm not sitting this out. Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her. The way he had that first night in the ballroom when she'd refused to move out of his way, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. Fine, he said. Stay close. The drive to the boys' location was the longest 20 minutes of Amara's life, gunfire and shouting fading behind them as Daniel navigated back roads at speeds that made her knuckles white against the door handle, Min-jae in the passenger seat, gripping his weapon, his jaw set in a way that told her exactly how far he was prepared to go to protect a son he'd known about for less than an hour. Talk to me, Amara said, watching him from the back seat, needing to hear his voice, needing something to hold onto besides the terror clawing up her throat.
Min-jae.
Talk to me. I don't know what to say to him, Min-jae admitted, staring straight ahead, his knuckles white around the weapon in his lap. I don't know how to be someone's father. I know how to run an empire. I know how to survive an ambush. I have no idea how to walk into a room and be what that boy needs me to be.
You show up, Amara said.
That's it. That's the whole first step. Everything else you figure out after. Min-jae looked back at her, something desperate and grateful in his expression. Why does that sound so much harder than everything I've already survived tonight? Because it is, Amara said quietly. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. And it's the only thing that will actually matter. Daniel took the final turn too fast, tires screaming against wet asphalt, and the house came into view. Lights blazing in every window, a black SUV parked crooked across the driveway, the front door hanging open. That's them, Daniel said grimly. Boss, I count at least 4. Maybe more inside. I don't care if it's 40, Min-jae said, already reaching for the door handle before the car had fully stopped. That's my son in there. They arrived to find Seo-jun's men already there, the boy's terrified adoptive parents held at gunpoint in their own living room, Ethan himself frozen in the corner, small and pale and utterly bewildered by the violence unfolding around him. Seo-jun stood in the center of the room, calm in a way that made Min-jae's blood run cold, the calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment for months. Brother, Seo-jun said, almost pleasant. I wondered how long it would take you to find him. Let him go, Seo-jun. Min-jae's voice was deadly quiet. This is between us. He's a child. He has nothing to do with what's between you and me. He has everything to do with it. Seo-jun's calm cracked, just slightly, revealing the years of resentment underneath. He's the reason Mother chose you. Always you, even when you weren't the one worth choosing. Even a hidden bastard's son mattered more to this family's future than I ever did. This isn't about mother's choices. This is about a child who never asked to be part of any of it. Seo-jun raised his weapon, pointing it not at Min-jae, but at the boy in the corner, and for one horrifying second, the entire room went silent. Take one step closer, Seo-jun said, and find out how far I'm willing to go to finally matter in this family. What happened next would define the rest of Kang Min-jae's life, and everyone in that room knew it. He had a clear shot. Years of training, of survival, of ruthless decision-making had built him into exactly the kind of man who could end this threat in a single motion, who had ended threats exactly like this one more times than he could count. But Ethan was watching him, 8 years old, terrified, staring at the father he'd never known he had, at the moment that would either confirm every fear that violence was the only language this family spoke, or prove that something different was possible. Min-jae lowered his weapon. Seo-jun, he said quietly, put down the gun. Whatever you think you need from this, power, recognition, mother's approval, killing a child won't give it to you. It'll only prove you belong exactly where you're headed, alone, hated, remembered as the man who threatened an 8-year-old to settle a grudge with his brother. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. Then Seo-jun's arm began to shake, the weight of the gun suddenly heavier than his conviction, and Daniel, who had circled silently around the back of the house during the standoff, moved in from behind and disarmed him before anyone else could react. It was over in seconds. Seo-jun was restrained, his men surrendering once their leader was subdued, and Min-jae crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in front of the small, trembling boy who was, against every odd, against every lie his family had constructed, his son. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice breaking in a way it never had in 38 years of careful control. "My name is Min-jae. I promise you, nothing is going to hurt you ever again." The boy looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes and then, slowly, cautiously, reached out and let this stranger, this father, take his trembling hand. Behind them, Amara watched, tears streaming down her face, and understood that whatever had begun as a contract, a transaction, a desperate man's attempt to buy an heir, had somehow, impossibly, become something real. We're almost at the ending now, and I promise you, it's worth every second you've spent watching. But before we get there, if this story has moved you even a little, smash that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people who need a story like this one. The days that followed the confrontation were quieter than anything Amara had experienced since arriving at the Kang estate, but the quiet felt earned rather than empty. Seo-jun was arrested and formally removed from any position within the organization, his attempted coup exposed to the senior members who had, for years, quietly tolerated his ambition without realizing how far he was willing to take it. Madame Heir, confronted with the full truth of what her manipulation had cost, a grandson raised as a stranger, a son nearly consumed by the very obsession she'd planted in him, retreated into a silence that spoke louder than any confession could have. Min-jae returned to the mansion that night, exhausted, his shirt still torn from the confrontation, and found Amara waiting for him outside the room where she'd been locked days earlier. The gates stood open now. No guards blocked the driveway. He crossed the distance between them slowly, like a man approaching something fragile he was terrified of breaking. "You're free," he said quietly. "The gates are open. There's a car waiting if you want it. No conditions. No contract. If you want to leave tonight, no one will stop you." Amara searched his face for any trace of manipulation, any hidden angle, and found none. Just exhaustion, and something rawer underneath it. Regret. Real and unguarded. "I wanted an heir so badly," Min-jae continued, his voice cracking slightly, "that I forgot people aren't possessions. I forgot that you're a person, with a life of your own, with the right to choose it. I locked you in this house because I was terrified of losing the first honest thing I'd ever had, and in doing that, I became the exact kind of man your mother's recording warned you about. I am sorry. I don't expect that to fix anything, but I needed you to hear it." Amara stood silent for a long moment, the weight of the last several weeks, the fear, the danger, the unexpected tenderness, the betrayal, pressing down on her all at once. "I need time," she said finally, "away from all of this. Away from you, away from this house, away from everything that's happened since the night I refused to move out of your way in that ballroom." Min-jae nodded, and if the answer hurt him, he didn't let it show beyond the slight tightening around his eyes. "Take whatever time you need." She left that night. No dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation, just a quiet exit through gates that, for the first time since she'd arrived, were genuinely open. 6 months passed. Kang Min-jae spent them differently than anyone who knew him would have predicted. He dismantled significant portions of the criminal operation his father had built, and he had expanded, quietly transferring the organization's legitimate business interests into structures that no longer required the violence that had defined his family for 2 generations. It cost him allies. It cost him rivals who saw weakness in the transition and tried to exploit it. He survived those attempts the way he'd survived everything else, through resolve, not cruelty. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to be a father. Ethan moved into the mansion permanently, and the boy who had once flinched at loud noises gradually learned that this house, despite everything, could be safe. Min-jae was there for breakfast, most mornings. He was there for the nightmares that came sometimes, legacy of a childhood spent not knowing where he truly belonged. He was learning, day by day, to be the father his own father had never been. But in the quiet moments, in the enormous house that had once felt like a fortress and now sometimes felt merely empty, Min-jae was lonely in a way that surprised him with its intensity. He didn't reach out to Amara. He'd promised her time, and he intended to honor that, even when every instinct told him to call, to check on her, to make sure she was safe. He let her go, fully, for the first time trusting someone else's judgment about their own life more than his own need for control. It was Amara who came back. She arrived at the estate on a quiet afternoon in early spring, unannounced, standing at gates that opened for her without hesitation the moment the guards recognized her face. She found Min-jae in the garden, Ethan beside him, the two of them planting something in the soil with far more enthusiasm than skill. Min-jae looked up, and for a moment, he simply stared, as though afraid that if he moved too quickly, the image in front of him might dissolve. Amara. I didn't come back, she said, walking toward him slowly, because you needed an heir. I know. I came back, she continued, stopping a few feet away, close enough now to see the exhaustion and hope fighting for space on his face, because I wanted to see who you'd become when nobody was forcing you to be a monster. I needed to know if the man in that hospital chair, the man who lowered his weapon in front of his son, was the real you, or just a version of you that only existed under pressure. Min-jae searched her face. And? What did you find? Ethan, sensing something significant happening between the adults, had quietly abandoned the garden and moved to stand beside Amara, looking up at her with the same cautious hope his father wore. Amara smiled, the first real smile she'd allowed herself in months. I'm still deciding. Min-jae laughed, the same short, surprised laugh from that first night in the ballroom, pulled out of him against his will, and this time there was nothing guarded in it at all. That's fair, he said. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Ethan reached up and took Amara's hand, small fingers curling around hers with an ease that suggested he'd already made his own decision about her, whatever the adults were still working through, and Amara felt something in her chest settle for the first time in what felt like years. Min-jae watched the two of them together, the son he'd nearly lost before he even knew he had him, and the woman who had walked into his life refusing to be bought, refusing to be controlled, refusing to be anything other than exactly, stubbornly herself, and understood, finally, the lesson his entire life had been trying to teach him. Kang Min-jae had spent 38 years believing that a legacy was something you built with power, with fear, with control, with an empire so vast that no one would dare challenge it. He believed, for most of his life, that blood and obedience were the only currencies that mattered. But in the end, standing in a garden with dirt on his hands and his son's laughter behind him, and a woman who had chosen, freely, to come back to him, he understood the truth his mother's manipulation and his father's cruelty had never allowed him to see. The greatest legacy a man could leave behind was never the empire he controlled. It was the people who freely chose to stay. And that's the end of this one. If this story hit you right in the chest the way it did for me writing it, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like this one coming your way. Drop a comment and let me know, did you see the twist with Ethan coming, or did it catch you off guard like it caught Min-jae? And if you loved it, share it with someone who needs a good cry today. See you in the next story.